Good afternoon. I'm really happy to be here. I know that you all spend your lives focusing on kids and families, and this presentation is really all about taking a moment to focus on yourself, helping you get through the last bit, we hope, knock on wood, of this incredibly long and complex disaster that we've all been living through. So I want to talk a little bit about what we're doing, and this is the second technology challenge. Can everyone see the agenda?
No, right now I just see the screen with your slide, or is that the agenda? Oh, I'm sorry.
Does it say, it should say agenda at the top, does it?
No, it says what size start responder measures.
Oh, that's not even the same. Hang on here. Let me stop. Let me fix my PowerPoint and then I will come right back. Hang on here. That is not the one I want. Apologies. Let's try this one. Okay, make sure it's got all the slides in it. It does. Okay, let's try this again. Now is everyone seeing the agenda?
Not just yet, might take a second to pop up.
All right, while it's popping up, let me just tell you a little bit about what we're going to be talking about in this presentation. So one of the things that we're going to be going over is basically how COVID has impacted all of us in terms of our behavioral health, as well as kind of where we think we're going to be going in the next couple of months. Understanding and managing burnout and compassion fatigue and overall exhaustion and the grief that we've all endured as part of this. How that's impacted us in the workplace and some ways to mitigate that in terms of particular communication styles, making it work so that we come through the pandemic not just surviving, but thriving in some way, having enhanced our personal resilience. And then Representative Orwell mentioned secondary trauma. And so what I'm going to do at the very end is run you through a tool that we've been training out widely through the Department of Health over the last year and a half that allows those of you who are experiencing this secondary trauma to track that for yourselves and engage your personal coping resources. All right, before I go any farther, let's see if
I have it available, Dr. McGuire. I can
pull it up for me if you would. I don't know what's going on with my PowerPoint.
You see my screen with the agenda.
Yep. And then we can go on to the very next slide if you don't mind.
Yeah, happy to change slides for you.
Thanks. All right, so we like this slide because it talks about the fact that it's not a one size fits all sort of approach to things. So just as in managing our physical health, multiple layers also improve our behavioral health success. So we're going to talk about all the layers that go into supporting ourselves and supporting our teams at work and supporting our organizations. Next slide, please. This is a slide that comes from SAMHSA, which is the Federal Substance Abuse and Mental Health Agency. And it is a representation of what happens in any disaster. So it doesn't matter if it's a hurricane or an earthquake, or as in our situation, hopefully once in a 100-year pandemic. All disasters tend to have certain phases to them. And along with those phases are specific behavioral health impacts of those. So if you look at this graph and you look over in kind of the left-hand side where you see the impact phase, For Washington State, that was probably March of 2020 when the governor started talking about shutting us down, basically, 2 weeks to flatten the curve and all of that. And that's when the disaster becomes very real. And so if you can remember back then, and it's hard to imagine anybody would forget it, I think the behavioral health response was sort of shock and awe. The word I heard the most often was surreal. This just feels surreal. I can't believe this is happening. And that's pretty typical. From there, we tend to actually go up. We're a resilient species by and large. And so we tend to become more socially cohesive. We start problem solving, how we're going to get through this, and we go into that heroic honeymoon phase. A colleague and I joke about how in a lot of disasters, that's the phase that we call that the Anderson Cooper in a black t-shirt phase. There's a lot of media attention. There's a lot of positive social kind of talking about things, problem solving. You see the same messaging over and over. We're Boston strong. We're Houston strong. We're in this together. But then in every disaster, and COVID is certainly going to be the poster child for this, we slide down into this long disillusionment phase. And that's the phase where we're all tired. We really want our lives back. We want to be in the before times. And it's becoming really clear that it's not changing anytime soon. We're going to be in the midst of this for the long haul. That's when behavioral health impacts are the greatest, is during that disillusionment phase. So we've had to modify this graph because of the incredible complexity and the length of time of this disaster. So you see these two lines over here. One sort of the golden line of reconstruction and recovery, and another kind of a dotted blue line that's a little bit lower and slower. And that's because we have had to take, we've had a number of hits throughout this. And while the most common behavioral health impact in any disaster, when we come all the way to the end, is recovery. Almost all of us recover to our baseline. Most of us don't go on to develop any kind of psychological disorder. Some of us will have a slower and harder pathway up. And so people on that blue dotted line are people often from communities that have experienced disparate impacts. So ethnic communities, racial communities, folks who have financial struggles, who may have lost their work or their businesses, people who are most directly impacted. So if you've gotten sick or had a family member get sick or die, those folks are having a harder time kind of coming up through and into the recovery phase. And that also on that line are children, a youth of all kinds who have been enormously impacted by this pandemic. So the rates of obsessive compulsive disorder, anxiety, depression, suicidal ideation, suicide attempts, all have jumped and stayed high throughout the pandemic for a variety of reasons. Probably most salient is the isolation involved in it. We also have been through what's called a disaster cascade. And I'm going to talk about this a little bit more in a slide or two. But if you think about a disaster on top of a disaster, so the community of Malden, for example, last year, almost exactly a year ago, living through a COVID pandemic and then had their community wiped out with a wildfire. That creates a disaster cascade. What happens in a disaster cascade is that we all go through the same reactions. We go through the impact phase, a little bit of honeymoon, and then a slide down into a secondary disillusionment phase, but we're coming at it already tired, already exhausted, exhausted interpersonally, and also exhausted in terms of just resources in general. So thinking about this was for us, the Delta wave was also a secondary disaster. We could see a little light at the end of the tunnel in early summer, and that turned out to be another train, unfortunately. So we have gone through this again with sort of significant behavioral health impacts. Next slide, please. These are two things that we have been following in adults for the last 18 months, anxiety and depression, which you can see have gone up, have gone down, certainly went up during the midst of the worst of the pandemic. We went through a time in the summer, again, where we almost got back to baseline pre-COVID levels, but we're starting to have another little uptick again, probably in relation to the COVID, the Delta variant of COVID. And keep in mind that these things, you can't add these things together. They're comorbid. So people who are anxious often get depressed, and people who are depressed often get anxious. So you can't like put together 1 million and then 1.5 million and say 2.5 million people. But an awful lot of us have had anxiety and depression symptoms. These symptoms are tracked. These would be symptoms that are significant enough to interfere with daily life. So pretty significant symptoms. Next slide, please. So kind of coming back to the disaster cascade effects, these are the things that we are thinking about in terms of what the impact is now and probably over the next couple of months. We're going to have increased behavioral health responses to this for a variety of reasons. And for healthcare providers, first responders, educators, anyone, folks like you, who are in contact with the public, the increased risk of burnout are significant. Healthcare providers in particular are at tremendous risk for psychological injury and moral injury related to the fact that we have kind of edged into what's called crisis standards of care, where they're being asked to provide care in a way that is not congruent with their values or their training or what they want to do, but put in that situation just because of the limitations of the healthcare system right now. So even as we're seeing the cases start to decrease, the hospitalization rates and death rates going down just a little bit, we're also heading into the winter months, which for those of us who live up in the north are traditionally associated with some mood changes just because the days become very short and dark, and it's difficult for us to get outside to kind of mitigate that. Next slide, please. So we have trained out this slide again for probably 1.5 years, and I highlight it here because it's such a nice way to describe kind of why we are being the way that we're being right now. If you look at that blue circle in the middle of the limbic system, that's the fight or flight system part of our brain. That's the threat assessment. That's the part that lights up when we feel like we're in danger or under threat in some way. And the chronic stress of this pandemic has had that system lit up for a long time. So if you have found yourself over the last 18 months being more snappy or irritable, crying more, just sort of being more emotionally reactive, there's a reason for that. And unfortunately, when the limbic system is activated, the prefrontal cortex, that little purple part in the front there, becomes less activated, kind of goes more offline. And that's the part of our brains that helps us to remember things like what day of the week it is and how it helps us get through our work. It helps us to plan, organize things. And it's that little voice in your head that says, maybe I shouldn't say that thing I'm thinking out loud. That is not working particularly well. So we have this combination where we're all kind of emotionally aroused and at the same time way less capable of managing our impulses. And we have seen this play out from the very beginning of the pandemic. The other difficulty with having your limbic system activated all the time is that your body starts to put out stress hormones like adrenaline and cortisol. And if you have a bear chasing you, you want all that on board. But when those hormones are circulating chronically, it creates some significant health impacts for us. So difficulty sleeping, pain, of all sort, muscle pain, headaches, stomach aches, a lot of excess fatigue. And it also suppresses our immune system, which obviously is not a great thing in the middle of a pandemic. So this is the underlying piece of why we are struggling so much and behaving in ways that are often very atypical for us. Next slide, please. So what we're focusing on, oops, go back one, there we go. What we're focusing on over the next couple of months are the impact on youth and families of returning potentially to in-person school and in-person work. I'm a clinician. I practiced, I'm a pediatric psychologist and practiced for 30 odd years. And almost always there was a summer slump. You know, the referrals would kind of slide down. The kids that were in therapy would take a break or they'd stretch out their sessions. They were out from under the stress of school. The weather was good. We didn't see that this year. And that is true probably nationally, but in terms of Washington State and in the Western states, where I'm part of a large ASPR grant, nobody was seeing that kind of summer slump. The kids continued to struggle. We think kids going back to in-person school, there's a whole chunk of them that are going to be reactive to that because it's exciting and wonderful to be back in school for some kids, but at the same time, it's incredibly anxiety provoking. And for kids who, for whom school was a place where they could not succeed or felt like they could not succeed or who were bullied at school, virtual schooling was a great place for them. It was a much safer place for them. And then all the parental and caregiver anxiety about going back to school and kind of making plans around that. One of my colleagues has 2 young children and they have been quarantined twice since the beginning of school. And of course, you have to work around your own workplace responsibilities. So a lot of uncertainty around that. And then in the workplace with the vaccine mandates and the deadlines for vaccinations, there will be some decrease in workforce available across a variety of settings. When people leave, it makes other people have more workload, and that creates potential for conflict and tension. And this whole sense of us versus them, which I think we have been seeing for pre-pandemic times, is certainly been exacerbated. And so again, you're going to be struggling, you may struggle within your workplace because your experience is may not be the same as your coworkers' experience, or your opinions may not be the same as your coworkers' opinions. And so we are really encouraging people to be mindful of being compassionate and flexible as much as is possible with our COVID brain within the workplace as well. Next slide. This is the other area that we're focusing on as a risk over the next couple of months. I think all of us have seen plenty of videos of full-grown adults having, the grown-up version of a 4-year-old tantrum. Again, it's kind of back to COVID brain, a lot of feeling and not much capacity to regulate. But we are concerned that the potential for violence and aggression is increasing because we have hardened our positions on 2 sides, often of many issues. And the 2 sides are equally convinced that they are correct. And we all have this arousal and lack of regulation capacity. And so we are encouraging workplaces, actually everybody, but particularly workplaces, to consider ways of communication that are likely to build more cohesion, that de-escalate that kind of aggression and anger that's sort of bubbling under the surface outside. And then thinking through options, thinking about what you will do, what the challenges are likely to be. And that's not to put you in a zone where we're asking you to be gloomy or negative, but when you think about what challenges may be coming in the workplace, it's actually a form of kind of coping. That's an active coping, not just a passive, sitting back and waiting for it to come for you. Next slide, please. There's a certain number of chemicals that make us feel happy and good, and these are the ones. And when, again, you are under chronic stress, all of these chemicals tend to decrease. So the things that make you feel rewarded, the things that make you feel content, that make you enhance your connection to other people, that little burst of endorphins or dopamine when you've exercised or you've done something and been successful at it, those are harder to come by. Next slide, please. And this is how it affects you. And in any disaster, the impact is global in terms of your system. It's not just being tired physically, it's feeling ill, it's having more infections and other illnesses, it's feeling tired, it's feeling like you hurt, lonely, having trouble with emotions, all of those things, because we're depleted and we have been depleted for months and months and months and months. There are ways of recovering that. And many of these are kind of grandma advice. Get outside, make a list, try to stay safely connected with other people within the context of, public safety and public health. Things that are sensory, like hot showers or cold showers, watching a movie that makes you laugh. All of these things are sort of common sense and in some ways, kind of cheesy advice, but there's a tremendous amount of research that underpins the fact that when you do these things, when you do these kind of self-care activities, you increase those chemicals, the hormones and neurochemicals that are so important for kind of keeping our balance in terms of our behavioral health. Next slide, please. So these things, burnout, compassion, fatigue, and moral injury, they're often kind of conflated, but they are really sort of different animals. Burnout is not just having so much work or so much responsibility that you're tired, but usually as a consequence of also feeling like you don't have the resources that you need to do the job that you want to do, or you may not have enough control over decisions in your workplace to allow you to do your job more effectively. And I would venture to say that everybody on this call has burned out on one or more jobs in the course of their lifetimes. Compassion fatigue is also exhaustion, but it has the additional layer of being so tired that you find it very difficult to care about what's happening to other people. And if you're in a position, if your job is one where your work is with other people, you're a helper of some sort, compassion fatigue is not a place that you want to go. And then moral injury, as I mentioned previously, that comes out of the combat literature. But it's when you are having to do a job in a way that violates your core values and principles. And so there's a lot of guilt associated with that and anger. And it's a little bit different than these others because it really is sort of formed by external circumstances. And then resilience is the good news, which is that resilience is something that you can learn and practice. We've all seen people that are sort of temperamentally resilient. They come into the world and they're easygoing, go with the flow, very flexible, but that's not all of us. But you can learn how to be resilient. You can practice the skills that go into resilience. And I'm going to go over that in just a second here. Next slide, please. So some real simple things to do in terms of managing burnout. And the biggest thing, the most important thing is boundaries, boundaries, boundaries. And that is hard to do when the work is important and you want to do a good job. And, when you end your day, there's still so much more out there to do. I forget who it was that mentioned earlier in this meeting, something about this has been a marathon. We thought it was a sprint, but it's turned out to be a marathon. And a colleague of mine said, it has been a marathon, but it's been at the pace of a sprint. And even if you are not a designated disaster responder, if you have been working through this pandemic, you are in some ways a disaster responder. So that's where the boundary part comes in. And for those of you who are leaders in your organization, team leads or supervisors, I will tell you that it does not matter what you say about boundaries if you don't model boundaries. I have been deployed because I've been a disaster responder for about 16 years. I've been deployed places where my team lead was saying all the right things. I want you guys to stay hydrated. Don't forget to eat and take a break. Get to bed early. We're going to have 200 probably show up at the clinic the next morning. And that same person is sending emails at 11 o'clock, midnight, and expecting those emails to be answered before the 7 o'clock team meeting. That doesn't matter what that person is saying. What that person is modeling is you can't stop. If you stop, you're not a good worker. You're not a good person. You're not an effective worker. So it's really incredibly important to be off when you're off and to try to get comfortable with the fact that the work will it's going to be there when you come back, but you won't be there if you don't do those things that take care of that in the short time. Next slide, please. So most of us work within these kind of three factors here. We're at work, we're on duty, it's clear. We're in this middle stage where, call me if you need me, if it's really important, and then we're off. Where things get troublesome is in that middle zone there, where it's so easy to edge from to call me if it's really important to just being available all the time. So again, cutting out those work and off time boundaries and being really clear about that, practicing a script. No, I'm sorry, I simply don't have capacity to do that right now. Or I will not respond to emails on the weekend unless the building is on fire or somebody is bleeding out. It better be really, really important. Next slide. And then we talk about compassion fatigue. We want those of us who work with other people who are helpers, we don't want to lose that aspect of us. And so we need to be very intentional about recognizing compassion rewards. And again, some of this advice can sound sort of simplistic and cheesy, but it is really important to be mindful about offering verbal support to other colleagues, to other members of your team, particularly if you're in a leadership position, highlighting what the team has been able to do under incredible circumstances. So sort of building those in intentionally, and then engaging in healthy, healthy self-care. So, if it's helpful at the end of the day to have a glass of wine with dinner, go for it. Half a glass of wine, not a half a bottle of wine or a bottle of wine. One person when I was doing this presentation was talking about when she had to attend a Zoom meeting that she didn't really want to attend and she got through it, she would give herself a chocolate from a little bowl that she had on her desk. So one chocolate, not a box of chocolates. But again, sort of putting that up on the front part of your head, maybe writing it down because COVID brain. These are things that help you get through. Next slide, please. Moral injury is tricky, as I said before, because it's triggered by external forces. And if you are not kind of frontline in having to deal with these care decisions, for example, where you're doing something that it feels wrong to you, like not offering the same care to everyone because there simply isn't enough care to go around. Moral injury has to be addressed sometimes with a spiritual advisor because it really is sort of a core soul injury, if you will. But there are some things that you could do in terms of self-care. Mindfulness is incredibly important. It's not for everyone. Some people get more anxious when they're doing mindfulness or relaxation exercises. And if you have a history of trauma, being very aware of of when you have experienced this sort of moral injury, and engaging in care as needed, but really trying to reframe the impact of this from some sort of failing on your part to more of a failing on the system at large. Next slide. So one of the things that is most prominent through this pandemic is this huge experience of loss. And any loss, I'm talking about loss of connection or loss of sense of identity in your workplace. It has impacted all of us in these big ways. I had the opportunities, and maybe you guys have experienced this too, right? I sort of stood back about a year ago and just reflected on the missed birthdays and holidays, big family gatherings, gatherings with friends, parties that we, might attend every year. And that incredible sense of grief over, a year of that we have somehow lost, isn't going to be recovered. It doesn't mean we won't recover, but it's hard to process loss when you're already tired. So just being cognizant, particularly as Delta has impacted all of us again, of, we are tired and we are going through that same kind of grieving process. I thought we were done with this. I thought we were coming out on the other side, and here we go again. Next slide, please. And some of us have experienced deaths in this year, some related directly to COVID, or some as a secondary impact of COVID. And so keeping in mind that the people that we are working with, some of them are living through a tremendous grief and bereavement. And there are some ways that are helpful, some things that you can do. The key things are stop. Don't make any big decisions in the middle of grieving. Being able to modify things, being flexible. It's hard to lose someone and then not be able to do the kind of normal rituals that we would have done if we were not in COVID, having a wake, going to a funeral, crying and laughing and remembering together with people instead of Zoom. But we have to modify these things. And then active listening. Active listening means you're not going there, now, but it means you're listening deeply. And we're going to talk a little bit about that in just a second. Next slide, please. So there are some communication basics that we are encouraging everyone who is in a workplace to learn and practice. Being aware of zones of regulation. I suspect I'm preaching to the choir with you guys. Active listening, which is a tool that you can use, and then de-escalation tools just to help deal with the incredible amount of anger that's out there. Next slide, please. So zones of regulation, we have this in here. It comes out of our family toolbox, actually, which is available on the website. But keeping in mind where you are in terms of these zones and where the other person is in terms of these zones, as far as being able to have a solution-focused conversation. So if somebody is in the blue zone, they are so low, they simply don't have the energy to engage, or someone is in the red zone where they are so agitated, they're not thinking very clearly. You can't have a conversation when someone is in that. If you are trying to have a conversation with your child when they're in the red zone, it's like trying to teach somebody how to swim when they're drowning. They're just not going to be able to do it. So both of those levels, the blue zone and the red zone, can be mitigated into the green and yellow zones by physical activity. So for kids, it's, go out and jump on the trampoline for 10 minutes, and then we'll talk about it. If, for adults, it might mean I need to go walk around the block a couple of times and see if I can get myself into a place where I can have a conversation that's going to go somewhere. And it takes about 30 minutes for your adrenaline levels to drop to a place where you can actually kind of think about and focus in on things. So keeping the zone where you are and the zone where the other person is in mind is kind of step one. Next slide, please. I am betting most or maybe all of you have been trained and practice active listening all the time. So if I'm preaching to the choir, forgive me. But I think it's a good thing to just go over briefly about what goes into it. We tend to be problem solvers. We want to solve the problem. And often our default is to get a little bit of information and immediately go to the, here's what you should do, or I would do this. When what is really often the most helpful thing is to listen deeply without interrupting, without thinking about what you want to say back, doing that clarification and reflection, which can feel kind of funny when you're first learning how to do it. Keeping in mind that even if you're wrong about, okay, so I think what you're trying to tell me is this, and the person says, no, that's not it. You have still given them the impression that you're listening, right? You're trying to figure it out. And then being empathetic about what's going on. If you get all the way through that, and then the person wants you to help them solve the problem, that's the time to do that. But often you get all the way through that, they've solved their own problem, or that's all they needed at that point in time. It's incredibly powerful intervention when it feels like you're not doing something. Next slide, please. So the other thing that we're all doing is dealing with people often who are really angry and upset. And I also suspect that a lot of you have been trained in de-escalation tools and techniques. This is just a short summary of those things for those of you who can't. My colleague is the queen of acronyms, we call her, and she developed this SAFE model. So we're going to talk about the separate sections that go into that. So yourself, area awareness, feelings on both parts, and then engagement. Next slide, please. So this is kind of issue number one. And it's hard to do. When someone comes at you and they're angry, your body reacts instantly and wants to get angry and defensive right back. So the very best thing you can do, if you can, is to tune in to what's going on with you. So your body language, your tone of voice, taking a breath so that you can get yourself calmed down. You know, what message are you giving without speaking? Being aware of that. And that's hard to do. It takes a little bit of practice, but, you know, using your monkey brain and their monkey brain, we have these wonderful things called mirror neurons. And so if I'm with somebody who's really agitated and I slow down the pace of what I'm saying and I lower the tone of my voice a little bit, and I take a couple of deep breaths, the person across from me almost can't stop themselves from doing that because that's the way we're wired. So get yourself calm. Getting yourself calm is also going to hopefully help the person you're talking to get calm. So that's the S one. Next one. Next slide, please. And then area awareness. If you're in-person work again, just paying attention to your physical space. Noticing who's around you, who might be able to help if things really get out of hand, where the exit is. It's sort of counterintuitive not to position yourself in front of the exit because you think you want to get out of there if somebody's going to take a swing at you, but you do not want to put yourself in front of somebody who wants to leave. So if you can position yourself so that you both have access to the exit, that's really helpful. And just paying attention to things that can be used against you. You know, you don't want somebody tossing a heavy stapler your way. Those things hurt. So just taking a quick kind of review, being situationally aware of what's around you physically is helpful. Next slide, please. And then feelings. If you can figure out what is underneath whatever is going on with that person, if they allow you to sort of explore that with them, almost always underneath anger is fear of some kind. It's just easier to express those angry feelings than it is to express feelings of being anxious or feeling afraid. But that's often what's underneath that. So many years ago when I was at Children's, well before they had all the security they have now. One of my colleagues got a call down to the PICU. This dad was there pacing, he had a big knife on his belt. He was a fisherman down from Alaska, and his little girl was in the PICU, and he was making the staff extremely anxious. He's yelling and walking back and forth and sort of agitated. And she walked down, stood for just a couple of minutes, and then approached him and said something along the lines of, "It must just be terrifying to have your little girl in the intensive care unit." And he burst into tears. And of course, that was what was underneath it all. And there was, some things that could be done that sort of alleviated that for him. But he looked scary and mean and aggressive. And underneath all that was a guy who was terrified that he was going to lose his child. Next slide, please. And then engaging once things have calmed down a little bit. If you can, it's fine to say, "I don't know the answer to that, but I'm going to go see if I can find out what the answer is," or "I can't provide that for you, but let me see if I can find someone who can." And then engaging support for yourself. All of us are tough, but these interactions with people who are really angry are toxic. These are not the things that you want to keep to yourself. These are things that you want to be able to share. And some of us, depending on kind of what our work is, we have experiences where we really can't share with our family and friends, not just because it's private it's confidential, but also because some things are so awful that you sort of traumatize other people who aren't in the situation with you. And so this is where having those colleagues, you have their back, they have your back, people who really know what that feels like to engage with and offer support is so incredibly important. Next slide, please. So these are the other active coping techniques for the three things we've heard most about this entire pandemic. One is just feeling anxious and on edge. And as I mentioned before, for some people, calming exercises actually ratchet them up and make them more anxious. So we include some other things in here, including sensory interventions like holding a frozen orange. For some people is enough distraction to help them calm down, to kind of get rid of that anxious on edge feeling. For others of us, it's music, it's hot showers, there's apps, there's wonderful apps that are free. We know that regulated breathing calms us down, even if we're anxious folks. Sleep has been a huge issue. Early in the pandemic, people were having weird dreams. We heard a lot of them. But we've seen two kinds of sleep issues throughout the pandemic. One is just laying in bed and not being able to go to sleep and worrying about having to get up the next day and function. But the more common one that has sort of risen later in the pandemic is going to sleep just fine because you're really tired, and waking up at 2 a.m. with a very busy brain, thinking about things. I got to remember this. I forgot to return this email, whatever it is. So sleep hygiene, going to bed, waking up the same time, even on weekends, as much as you can, watching for alcohol and sugar. If you've had too many alcoholic drinks, the alcohol disappears just about the time that you don't want to wake up, and it tends to wake you up. Having a notepad next to the bed, nothing with a blue light, not your phone, not your iPad, not your laptop. Writing down the things that you're thinking about may help you to go back to sleep. And then for those who have struggled with being so flat, so exhausted, so sad that it's hard to get moving, just some little behavioral activation steps, just doing one different thing during the day, even if it's, I'm going to walk down to the second house and come back. That's all I'm going to do today. Any kind of movement, those things are incredibly helpful in sort of getting the energy level back up a little bit. And they make a big difference. They sort of open up the reward centers in the brain, even though that seems impossible that, walking 2 houses down could do that, but it does, it actually works. Next slide, please. So resilience, and I will encourage you to do a paper and pencil exercise with this. We describe it as purpose, what gets you up in the morning, connection, who or what kinds of things bigger than yourself are you connected to, being flexible and adaptable, which is hard for some people, and then not losing sight of hope. That's sort of the bottom part of it. That's the part that that keeps us all going. And to go through a little exercise and write down the answer to these things. What is it that gives you purpose? Who are you connected to? You know, what's a little bit bigger than yourself? How can you learn to be flexible when you just want to go back to the before times or move on to the past? We're done with the COVID times. Next slide, please. So it said peace, but my colleague with the queen of acronyms changed this to thrive. And you will get a copy of this slide deck. So if I move through really quickly, you'll have a chance to go through and review it. But these are just kind of the segments that we think are important for people to keep in mind, to remember, to engage in and do as we get through the end of what we hope is this marathon. So talking about things that bother you, being transparent about that, paying attention to your health, taking time before hitting send and talking to other people because we're all kind of activated, trying to be as congruent about how you're feeling and acting as you can. That's hard to do sometimes. Using your values, your core values, to help you map out kind of where you want to be, because sometimes we don't have facts and contents. We have to make a decision and we don't have all the facts. So you try to make those decisions on the basis of what your core values are. Even if you turn out to be wrong about the facts, you have at least made that decision in a kind of an integrity way. And then effort, you know, we are not performing like we did before the pandemic, and there are really good reasons for that. Effort counts. So how are your kids doing in school within the context of the fact that they are trying to perform within a 100-year pandemic? And how are you doing at work within that same kind of context? Giving yourself a break in terms of the product and really emphasizing the effort that's continuing to go into it. Next slide, please. Writing this down again, very quickly, things that have been helpful, being willing to try new things, any kind of physical activity, whatever coping strategies work for you. Next slide. And pausing, and I'm going to move real quickly through because I know that my time is getting short, but I do want to go through this tool for all of you, just to give you the opportunity to learn it and to figure out if you want to go sign in on it and play with it. So let's go to the next slide. So here's why. About 90% of us in the middle of any disaster have some sort of stress impact. We have symptoms of something, sleeping, distress symptoms, a little anxiety, a little depression. Those things are not predictive of longer-term psychological disorders. But the closer we are to the impact of the pandemic, the more at risk we are. And so one of the ways of not responding to symptoms, but responding to actual risk is to monitor the exposure to things that create that risk. Next slide, please. So SciStart Responder is a tool that was originally developed for disaster responders, first responders, frontline healthcare workers. It's been modified a little bit for COVID. It doesn't measure symptoms because symptoms are not predictive. What it does measure is exposure to things that have been found through research to put you at risk for things like depression or post-traumatic stress disorder. And so we have expanded this little triage measure to address secondary exposure as well, because behavioral health providers, anybody who is working within a situation where you are hearing and being exposed to these sort of terrible events that human beings go through, we experience secondary trauma related to that. And so this is a way of measuring that secondary trauma. So for example, you know, you may not be in the hospital where children are dying, but if you're hearing stories about that, you would record that as an exposure. Let's move to the next slide and I will show you how this works. So we would ask you to develop a personal coping plan, first of all, by anticipating what's hard for you and what's likely to be hard for you. That's part of that active coping. So what a part about your job, the stories that you're hearing, the people that you're working with who've been through such terrible things often, what parts about those are as particularly hard for you? Write those down, because with our COVID brains, we will not remember those, and it's good to have a go-to. Next slide, please. And then we want to know what works for you. How do you cope typically? Everybody has different ways. It's not a one size fits all. We want you to sort of list what your coping strategies are, what your stress responses are, and then how you typically cope. Next slide. I want to write these down again, because COVID brain, what's hard? Next slide, please. And your stress reactions, again, not all of us respond in the same way. I get headaches. You might not get headaches, but you might get stomach aches, or you might have trouble sleeping. Next slide, please. Your resilience factors. What do you bring into this? I'm pretty good at my job. I think I make a difference. Those things count. I tend to be a flexible person. All of those things. You want to remember the parts that you bring in that make you strong. Next slide. What works for you in terms of coping? I'm not a human being if I don't run, for example, or I need to breathe. I like to get pictures out of my family.
Michelle, what's up?
Hey, it's important to have a go-to, and then to think about what you might want to add to that. Next slide. Social support plan, as I talked about before, sometimes your colleagues are going to be your most essential support plan. Who are those people? Write that down. Next slide, please. And then workplace things that are available to you, EAPs. If you feel like you need some professional care, evidence-based interventions that are trauma-focused, that help with the symptoms that come up, who might you refer yourself to? What else do you need? Next slide, please. And then we've got resources available. Next slide. So the way that SciStart Responder works is you set up a personal account, and I would encourage you to write down this information, the login information, and the drop-down menu and all of that, or you can take a screenshot of this if you'd like. This is how you get into the system. This allows you to triage yourself for that secondary exposure. So you go to this URL, there's a little button at the top that says log in, or it'll say join us, and you would create an account there. Next slide, please. And then let me just emphasize here that you would be the only person ever who could see what you put in here. You don't even have to put in your real name or your real age or your gender or anything that identifies you, even though no one can have access to this but you. This is strictly your information. When you log in and you're ready to triage, this page will show up, and you will create your own password. It will let you do that. And then each time you click agree, and those of you who are attorneys, this is just basically, I understand this is intellectual property and I blah, 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 and log in. Next slide, please. And from there, you could put in a date. It kind of is important to identify dates because that allows the system to help you track what your exposure has been. And then next slide, please. And then these are the things that you might be clicking off. It's strictly a yes only. So let's say, for example, um, one of your colleagues got very sick with COVID last week and ended up in the hospital. You would click serious injury, illness, or death among your coworkers. Or if you heard about this from, let's say, from a child that you're working with, my grandma died last week, and you find yourself impacted by that, you would click that, even though it's not directly yours. It's a secondary exposure to that. Next slide, please. This is just the triage sheet, so it just goes on. If you feel like your life was in danger, or if somebody's reporting to you, I thought I was going to die in this situation that I was in. Next slide, please. And at the end of the triage, and it takes maybe 2 minutes to do the triage, you click submit, and next slide, please. You can create a PDF, and next slide, please. And then this is what this might look like. If you go into the My SciStart, this is your triage only. No one else can see this. You can see that on a specific day, your risk was up a little bit more than maybe another day. And you can also see the trend. And when you find the trend going up, or you see that you've had a day or two that were particularly difficult for you, that's the trigger to really actively engage in your coping plan, in your active coping plan, doing the things that make you feel better, doing the things that allow you to keep going, thinking about whether you need to do something else. What else might you need to add? Next slide, please. And then there is a next step, which this is for Oregon Health and other places, but the tab is still there. The PTSD app through the Veterans Administration is amazing, and it has all kinds of little modules. If you're having trouble sleeping, or you're having trouble with recurring thoughts, there's a lot of material on the SAMHSA site. There just is a wealth of things out there, and these are just some of them that you can access. Next slide, please. And then I would encourage you to do a screenshot of this one as well, in case you run into technical difficulties and you get bumped out of your account. I think that's the end. Let's see, next slide, please. These are the trainings that are available and resources. They're all on the DOH website. We are doing SciStart responder trainings. We will continue to do them. So you can access those through the Department of Health. They're free. We do them, I think, 2 or 3 a month at this point. They take about a half an hour, very similar to what you've been through, but a little slower pace if you need that. Next slide, please. If you're interested in the forecasts or the situation reports, those are also available on the DOH website. Our team puts together a monthly forecast to guide organizations in terms of planning. Here's what we think is going to happen over the next month or so in terms of behavioral health impacts, things that you might want to be particularly aware of. That's once a month. We have weekly situation reports, which is data, boots on the ground. Here's how many people showed up at the ED with suicidal ideation or suicide attempts. Here's what's happened in terms of Washington Listens. It's really sort of data driven, and we have one that comes out monthly for youth in particular that looks at things like how many youth were involved in an active way in the criminal justice system in the last month, firearms sales, those kinds of things in the sit reps. And then toolboxes. There's a behavioral health toolbox for families, which came out of a request for, please, can you give us something more than a tip sheet? And most recently, we've put out a Think toolbox, which is all about resources, in-depth, evidence-based interventions for kids, caregivers and parents, and school staff as we return to school. And I think I'm done. I think I'm well over time. I don't know if we have time for questions, but I'm happy to answer them if there are.
We definitely do. No, you have a whole 10 minutes for questions. So.
All right. Then
and
the timing is good.
I will be putting in the chat the links for how to log into the SciStart just now.
Thank you. That's really helpful. All right.
There was one question in the chat that I can read to get us started off. So Cole would like to know your thoughts about specific impact on parents and the intersection with many of these issues of trauma you're speaking about. How can we better support families in crisis, especially during COVID? Being a parent has been a distinct level of struggle.
It has been, it really has been. And one of the things that we know is that if you support the parents, you support, or the caregivers, you support the family. They're often not the identified focus of concern, but it makes a tremendous difference if you're able to even to just acknowledge how hard it is, you know, to have had to work from home, for example, or to have had to go to in-person work and leave your child unsupervised, not attending their virtual classes. Tremendous stressors all across the board for people who have, you know, lost jobs or had to go to jobs that put them at risk, or had to figure out how to, you know, run a Zoom meeting with their team with their dog barking in the background and their 3-year-old running around, or their husband walking behind in their shorts. All of those things, just acknowledging that we have all gone through things. Some of us have gone through terrible things. And I think the other quote that I heard that I really like is, we've all gone through the same storm, but we have not all been in the same boat. And I think that is, those words are really true.